Good afternoon, everybody. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to our panel discussion on the causes and consequences of fragility and conflict. I'm Caroline Heider. I'm the Director General of the Independent Evaluation Group at the World Bank. And we have done a number of evaluations that speak about this subject. We have looked at fragility in fragile states. We have looked at fragility in middle-income countries that have situations of fragility. And we have looked at various other disaster risk responses that the World Bank Group has undertaken. At IEG, our keen interest is to draw lessons from the experience of the World Bank Group, share it across the institutions, share it across the client countries, and draw lessons so that mistakes that are made are new mistakes, that we don't repeat making mistakes that have been made and where lessons can have been learned, or where we can also build on successes. So we are very pleased to have an extremely important and powerful panel, very high-level panel, that brings together wisdom, experience, and political heft to make a difference. And a difference in addressing the causes and consequences of conflict and the plight of forcibly displaced people. As all of you know, the headline news today, the horrors of conflict, the impact on people's lives, the pressure on communities and on countries, created disquiet in all of us, whether it is a moral, political, or economic dilemma that we face. The challenge I want to put to the panel, and actually all of you here in the audience, is what will be different next time around? Will we just see yet another cycle where conflict spins out of control, people are migrating, people are trying to get out of harm's way? Or can the institutions that we have here at the World Bank and IMF annual meeting come to agreements and come to bring together their thought leadership to develop new solutions to address these perpetual problems? Far too often, public perception and policy responses follow the news cycle, which tends to highlight, say, a single conflict like in Syria right now, but then moves on to something else that sort of grabs the headlines in the press. The reality is that fragile situations and violent conflicts exist also in other places, as many of us who work in this area know. And they exist well before they reach the headlines or the spotlight, and they continue to exist even afterwards. So the question is, how can we get to making longer-term engagements a reality? Engagements that go beyond addressing the immediate needs of the humanitarian crisis, but build institutions, build systems, build also a private sector that can help prevent these crises or create institutions that can respond much more quickly to crises as they arrive. From IEG's perspective, I would like to share some highlights from our work. There are 35 countries that the World Bank Group has looked at and considers as fragile, with an estimated 2 billion people now living in these countries. This has provided us with an extensive resource on which we could draw to analyze and assess what the World Bank Group, with its vast range of skills, instruments, has provided to these countries, and draw lessons from that are valuable for many other countries and situations and institutions to share. For the most part, the Bank Group's comparative advantage lies in tackling long-term development challenges, even in these situations of fragility. What makes for success is early engagement, sustained presence, as well as continuous dialogue with all parties involved. Not surprisingly, the support from the World Bank Group is more effective when they are based on a good understanding of the local context. In particular, an understanding of the drivers of conflicts, the political economy, and the issues around inclusive growth need to be understood. This requires deep knowledge of what helps and what hinders economic empowerment of women or promotion of the private sector and growth and jobs. This is just as 2-3 examples of illustration. All of these things can lead to fragility, to conflict, to violence. Our work, however, shows that far too often the depth of the analysis, the tailoring to the context is not sufficient, or even when that analysis exists, it is not consistently used in developing strategies and operations. In low-income countries, in fragility, support for state building is essential. Here, a key to success is the in-depth understanding of the political economy and using that in longer-term reform processes. These reform processes need to bring together all different parties so that they can come together around a shared agenda for state building. In middle-income countries, we find that the work of the World Bank Group can be more effective. For instance, more can be done to go beyond supporting livelihoods in conflict-affected communities. Investments are needed in a functioning public sector, in particular its financial management, and an environment that allows the domestic private sector to grow and international investors to become interested in investing in these areas. When it comes to crisis response, a number of our evaluations found that great commitments are made at the time an emergency is in the headline news. But follow-through is weak as soon as the spotlight is off. This is not only an experience from the World Bank Group, but across the whole humanitarian sector. Instead of trailing the cycle of calamities, countries and their partners have to get ahead of the curve. In good times, they need to build institutions and systems that equip them to prevent calamities and respond to them quickly when needed. For multilateral institutions like the World Bank and the UN, we see the need for greater collaboration among all the actors in this field. And we're very happy to have our speakers and our panelists here because many of them have experience across these institutions and can speak more about the need and the opportunities for collaboration from each institution's comparative advantage point of view. This is not only good for the institutions, this is very important for the countries whose resources are limited and who need to draw the best out of each institution, what they can bring. Looking at all of this experience, I put the question to the panel, can we now make a shift that places more emphasis on sustained efforts to build capacities? Institutions much needed to prepare for and respond more quickly to the fallout of calamities, whether from conflict, disaster, climate change, or disease. And to help with that, answering this question, we have this distinguished panel that our moderator, Raj Kumar from DEVEX, will be introducing. But before that, I would like to invite to the stage His Excellency Mr. Jan Eliasson, the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, to open this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Director General Haider, dear Caroline, Lord Mark Malloch-Brown, one of my predecessors as Deputy Secretary General of the UN, distinguished panelists, distinguished participants. I'm honored to be asked to deliver opening remarks at this important event focusing on fragility and conflict and also addressing the causes and consequences. Everything is in that rubric for this afternoon session. This is a subject that is growing on all of us, I suppose. In the UN, we are, of course, dealing with the many conflicts that are plaguing the world, and above all, a lot of people. We are also seeing now the challenges of development, the imbalances, the inequalities, and we see also the importance of institutions and access to justice and the rights perspective. Everything is coming together. We just concluded the general debate in the General Assembly, and it was, of course, a strong call to the agenda of maintaining international peace, but also now going ahead with the Sustainable Development Goals, make them a reality, and also linking it to the issues of the day. We have the migration challenge, which was very high up on the agenda, and we have the growing realization that all these areas, peace and security, development, institution building, good governance, the rights perspective, are interrelated. We have to develop a culture, in my view, of working horizontally and less vertically and in silos. And that's where we take advantage of the international system, international organizations. And one of the examples of this growing realization is the intensity of relations between World Bank and the UN system. So San Francisco and Bretton Woods are coming together, finally, as we wanted from the beginning, 1945, 46. Some of us were around at that time. Now, the speakers in New York a couple of weeks ago also underscored the magnitude and the complexity of today's challenges and crises. The number of civil wars has tripled in the past 10 years. Their human toll has been devastating. 65 million people have been displaced and forced from their homes, the highest number since World War II. 125 million people at least are in urgent need of humanitarian relief. And by the way, let's let our thoughts now go to Haiti. The latest figure of casualties that I received was 800. So let us really do everything to mobilize for the poor Haitian people that have gone through so many stages of disasters. Now, in the Middle East and Africa, the effects of violent conflicts or extremism reach far beyond national borders. Boko Haram began in Nigeria, but now affects other countries in the region, around Lake Chad. Al-Shabaab in Somalia is no longer restricted to Somalia, but has crossed borders, as you all know, into not least Kenya. Conflicts are giving rise to terrorism and violent extremism, which in turn pose a serious threat to global security. Mainly, of course, through its direct impact, but also through sometimes counterproductive responses, not least to the conscious efforts of these extremist groups to sow fear and sow division and exploit these fears and these divisions, as we see also in the political map in parts of the world today. These conflicts are testing the global peace and security architecture established in the wake of the World War II and at the creation of the United Nations. I can tell you that peacekeeping and humanitarian operations are under serious strain. In the 2 years between 2012 and 2014, United Nations peacekeeping forces increased by 60%. The UN humanitarian appeals now call for over $20 billion a year, 80% of which is to meet needs generated by conflicts and fragility. These wars have shown the limits of conventional conflict resolution. 2/3 of United Nations peacekeepers and 90% of UN's political officers are now working in countries where I would claim there is hardly any peace to keep. In several situations, we now have to deal with non-state actors with conflicting agendas and extremist ideologies, making mediation and diplomacy extremely complex. Also, there is a dangerous trend in conflicts turning into proxy wars, internal conflicts turning into proxy wars, where the interests of outside powers clash and prolong crisis to sometimes an unbearable degree. Just think of Syria and the nightmare that goes on there. Meanwhile, there is a growing and blatant disregard, neglect of international humanitarian law and human rights and human dignity. Hospitals and aid convoys are bombarded, civilians are targeted, and there is widespread impunity for the perpetrators. Unless we develop political will and policies to work collectively to prevent and end these conflicts, they will create ever deeper suffering and ever more profound challenges and dilemmas for the international community and for individual member states, as we see. These strains are translating also into sometimes a very sensitive and difficult political debate. Now, the imperative to build and sustain peace was reiterated last year in the major reviews of the tools and approaches that the UN uses to respond to conflict. These reviews on sustaining peace and on peacekeeping and peace operations and women in peace operations, all these reviews underscored that humanitarian assistance may mitigate suffering and peacekeepers may stabilize situations, yes, but they cannot create lasting development, lasting security, and lasting peaceful societies. The reviews led up to the landmark identical Security Council and General Assembly resolutions on sustaining peace in April this year. These resolutions emphasize that we must move much more towards prevention and political solutions. We need comprehensive approaches that cover security, development, and the human rights and rule of law dimensions. These resolutions are fully in line with the vision of 2030 Agenda of Sustainable Development, which is another major tool to work more across the different functions and different subjects. It also very much is in line with the outcomes of the World Humanitarian Summit held in Istanbul in May, not least on taking away the artificially sharp line between humanitarian action and development, the nexus that exists, the dynamics that should exist between humanitarian action and development, which also underscores the importance of UN World Bank cooperation, by the way. Now, taken together, these frameworks form a comprehensive and I would say mutually reinforcing development and peace agenda that meets our obligations to, if I use a lot of P's here, forgive me, obligations to people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnership. Within the United Nations, we have begun a process of bringing the system together, breaking out of the silos that have for long kept development, humanitarian affairs, human rights, peace and security separate, instead of dynamically and actively interdependent. This is not a task for the UN alone. Member states will also need to rethink their approach to the vital work of peace building and conflict prevention along these horizontal lines, combining peace, security, development, and the rule of law and human rights. We need the expertise and sustained focus of member states in order to gain greater coherence. We are a member state-driven organization. We also need, I must say, their financial resources. Experts estimate, believe it or not, I had to check this figure 3 times. Experts estimate that in 2015, last year, violence and conflict around the world cost more than $13 trillion. $13 trillion. Around $1,800 for every person on this planet. And yet, the United Nations Peacebuilding Fund struggles to raise $100 million per year, the bare minimum it needs to carry out its priority areas. Tasks. I'm glad to say that the pledging conference we had in New York brought in $152 million. So we're on the right track. But compare those two figures, please. Effective prevention and sustainable peace depend on policy coherence. Great strides forward can be made through a combination of investments in security as well as institutional and socio-economic development, of course. Using these tools successfully will require greater interaction between different stakeholders and institutions, nationally and internationally. The UN is working closely with the World Bank along this line of interaction. One example was the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon's trip together with President Jim Kim to different parts of the world. They were in Africa, Sahel, they were in the Middle East, and they were also then in the Middle East, they went to Jordan and Tunisia earlier this year. And the World Bank is now providing important support to Jordan's economy as it deals with the strains of hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees, together with UNHCR and other UN entities. And by the way, in this context, naming UNHCR, I suppose you join me in welcoming the nomination of Antonio Guterres as the new Secretary General. He is to be confirmed by the member states next week, but I'm sure that his name will be well received. Now, We have also made a joint commitment with the World Bank to examine how development policies and programs can contribute to the prevention of violent conflict. We aim to launch a global study on this at the UN General Assembly and at the annual meetings of the World Bank Group and International Monetary Fund next year. In closing, if we think of conflict as a house of fire, the international community has for too long been the fire brigade, rushing to put out the flames and save lives. But today's fire brigades must spend much more time on prevention. We must be in the conflict areas when the smoke develops, or even better, when the arsonist reaches for the match. For too long, the international community, including the Security Council, I must say, has resisted this obvious conclusion when we see the conflicts explode around us. Yes, we must respond to them. We must resolve conflicts which are out there. But yes, we need to do far more to address the fragility that causes them. We need to prevent and we need to rebuild to avoid relapse. We are now both in the Bretton Woods and San Francisco community committed to working together to bring about this change of direction. And I thank you all for your support and engagement in this noble pursuit. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for excellent opening remarks, very inspirational and really touching on all of the really big issues that are around us. I would like to call now on Lord Mark Malloch-Brown, who will give us a keynote speech. Lord Mark Malloch-Brown has had many, many different hats. He has worked at the World Bank, he has been at the UN, he is now the chair of the Business and Sustainable Development Commission and chairman at Smartmatic International Corporation. And he brings many other experiences to this discussion. Welcome.
Caroline, thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Secretary General. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be back in the Preston Auditorium. As Caroline said, I am a veteran of having been both on the World Bank side of the debates about this institution's role in conflict and having been at the UN. And sometimes those relationships have felt almost as conflict-prone as the conflicts we're mutually trying to stop. And in fact, while I'm not old enough like Jan to remember quite as far back as he did, I do at least, youth that I am, remember back to the 1990s when the conflict unit was established here at the World Bank. And I remember the expressions of doubt that many of my colleagues at the time expressed about it, commenting that this really wasn't appropriate territory for the World Bank to get into, that it was better left to the UN. Well, I argued then, and I believe even more profoundly now, that getting out of conflict is simply not an option for a development institution like this. As your 2011 World Development Report pointed out, in those countries where there is conflict, the poor are 21% poorer than they would be without that conflict. Like Jan, I was struck by this astonishing figure of the $13 trillion cost of conflict. Or that's again, something like just over 13% of world GDP. And it's a real tax, if you like, on political failure, inability as a global society to manage and prevent conflict. And if as a development institution we were looking for yet another reason why we have to be in this space as the World Bank Group, it's the new SDGs, and particularly SDG 16, with its call to promote peaceful and inclusive societies. So one way or another, I welcome the fact that the bank is as engaged as it is in this area, and that we're here today to evaluate both how the bank's done and how it could do better. And I think the first point to make is that there is a sort of almost an instinctive view that conflict is crowded into the poorest countries. And yet actually the people at risk of violence, 74% of them are in middle-income countries, as the IEG report points out, and only 25% in the LICs. So we have to escape this idea that somehow it's a pyramid and the fragile, broken countries are at its very bottom, or that it's a ladder and you progress up the ladder and leave conflict and violence behind. If we want an architectural analogy, it's not a ladder, it's a revolving door. Countries move in and out of conflict at different points in development, because development, as we all know, is a dynamic process which creates new patterns of winners and losers, and at times the conflict between them tips into violence. So if you take modern Nigeria, under the last president, conflict broke out in the north, a largely Muslim area that felt neglected by a southern president, but that president was more successful in containing violence in the Niger Delta. And you can almost see it now switching with some mitigation of Boko Haram violence in the north, and yet the emergence of a new group in the south, the Avengers, as the political center changes in Abuja and a northern president is now in office. So, you know, we just have to recognize, I think, the integral part in the development story of conflict and violence. And that, again, is why it's so important that it stands at the center of the World Bank's mandate as a development institution. But saying that the World Bank should be involved in this is not the same thing as saying it should do everything. Because there are clearly issues where it enjoys much more comparative advantage than others. And part of the original critique of, oh, the bank shouldn't get into this, that I remember from the 90s, remain true, because there are impediments to its operation across all areas. Let me just cite one. You know, at the UN, we used to, and we've been criticized for it, often and frequently put our people in harm's way. The requirements of peacekeeping and often of mediation required that our staff took great personal risks, and the consequence has been, over the years, a tragic loss of both civilian staff and peacekeepers' lives. There is a huge amount of bravery in World Bank staff too, but it's a little bit less part of the personnel contract to be in situations of danger. So I was very struck that the IEG report itself observed that one of the biggest difficulties they had was actually physically accessing some of the countries some of the parts of countries where they were assessing conflict and violence. Well, if you can't get there, there's a limit to what you can do. And I think we have to just recognize that there are certain limitations in terms of access for a bank such as this, a development bank such as this. Second, there is, even today, and many of you will balk and tell me, you were at the UN too long, you don't really understand this great institution. But to some extent, money remains your principal development tool. And in many of these conflict and fragile state situations, money is not actually the tool to lead with. It can aggravate, it can advocate conflicts by trickling through in uneven ways which reinforce the existing pattern of disadvantage and power rather than overcoming it where institutions are weak. Thirdly, there is in the bank's model of development correctly, a great dependence on government institutions. And yet in many cases of fragility, and particularly in the weaker states, there are not government institutions to partner with, or certainly not ones which can, in a sense, carry out the development mission you wish to empower them with. And so finally, there is, on the side of some of your partners, particularly the UN, much greater political and security skills often than within the bank, and finding ways to draw on those strengths to partner with them is, I think, critical, rather than believing that this institution can substitute for them. And, in sum, a bank which is used to partnering with government around a shared development agenda finds itself in some difficulty when the government, who should be its partner, is either at war with its citizens or at least preventing violence against a significant portion of them. And finally, there's a contradiction between the reason why the bank is so successful at raising resources for its trust funds, including in the fragile state area. And what is that reason? A reputation for fiduciary caution and responsibility, for careful financial housekeeping. And yet the very nature of the challenge in this space requires that you take risks. That you put money and resources at risk, because without risks, you're simply not going to get results. And I think this fear of being caught wasting resources because not everything works particularly displays itself in the passion that many parts of the institution have for what is euphemistically called piloting, which actually means putting a very little money at risk, even when the problem is very big. Because, I think you have to recognize that to really make a dent on a large conflict, assuming that my first concern of earlier in my remarks is not there and that money can make a difference, you've got to put significant amounts of it into play in order to secure that difference. And so the IEG report notices that there's a lot of the sort of community development projects, and that these do useful work generating jobs and income, but that they don't achieve the cohesion within societies that they were intended to provide. And so, I think there is a tentativeness about bank engagement in this area, a lack of ambition and scale, which means that you just don't have as much of an impact as ideally you should. And look, having myself run UNDP and been a vice president here who had to answer questions from governments about what we'd done with their resources, I understand the innate caution and conservatism. Donors are very ungenerous with mistakes. And yet, the nature of development in this, as in all other areas, is that sometimes you should know that you're not doing good unless you sometimes get it wrong, because you're simply not taking enough risk. And risk has to be a critical part of what we do, even though it's risk obviously preceded by careful analysis and weighing of likely results. So, I think we've got to sort of think where the World Bank can really have comparative advantage in this space, and for it to focus, as this report is intended to help it do, on the things it can do better than others. And, a key point, as I've said, is partnership, partnership, partnership. Learn from other actors in the space. But obviously, and I know this from having worked so closely on both sides of this, there is in areas like public sector financial management or on funding of key service sectors like health and education. And when you have the courage and can do it to scale, the resources you can bring to bear, there are huge things you can do. There is also a huge thing in terms of bringing in the private sector, and sometimes it's with IFC, because when so much of the conflict is in middle-income countries, it is not impossible to bring the private sector into these spaces because they're adjacent to where they're already operating if they have the courage to adjust and adapt their business model and take on extra risk themselves. But I also think your small and, I think, underrated arm of MEGA is another key part of this, because political risk insurance is a critical tool for bringing people bringing private sector resources into this. But I think we've got to just, most critically as in the bank, you've got to weave into your whole concept of development this permanency of violence and conflict, this sense that it's not a ladder which you climb and you leave conflict and violence behind. When I look at so many of the countries that you studied in this report, countries such as Colombia and others, one recognizes Lebanon because of the refugee impact and other sources of conflict. These are countries which have very sophisticated government sectors, very successful parts of their society living adjacent to areas of great need and failure and breakdown of security. And so finding solutions which bridges the two so that you are partners to the whole country, not just the more organized, stabler part of the country, is absolutely critical. And particularly if we take Lebanon and Jordan, as was mentioned by Jan, finding models which help with the great challenge of refugee and migrant sort of sustainability in terms of drawing them as much as possible into local labor and employment markets are critical areas where this institution has a real advantage. But let me just move very quickly to the point of partnerships. A couple of remarkable colleagues I was familiar with who left the bank and came to the UN and did wonderful jobs, but when they tried to come back to the bank, they were put on this sort of 6-month thing. If you can't find a job in 6 months, you're out. And it reminds me of when I was at the bank, and it was the same in those early days when staff went to the field. It seemed to be a real disadvantage to your career to do that. And then that all got cracked and solved, and today this is a bank which is proudly field as well as headquarters oriented. You have to do the same with transfers across the system. You have to incentivize you and your colleagues to go out and gather experience from the UN and from NGOs and others engaged in similar spaces. We've got to find a way of resolving the funding competition. If you remain as you are, the great sort of masters of trust fund management, then you have to find ways to allow UNDP and others to access those funds. I spent years trying to solve this when I was administrator of UNDP without huge success. And yet, a UNDP can increase rapidly the rate of implementation because of its greater, more labor-intensive field presence in these areas, as can other agencies like UNHCR and WFP and UNICEF, and as can many NGOs. There has to be a much greater respect in many cases for the UN SRSG's leadership. That is the individual who in many cases has the oversight of the whole post-conflict set of issues, who can help integrate economic development with security and political stability. And at the moment, we are so siloed in terms of how we work at the country level. The UN Peacebuilding Commission, which I had much of a hand in helping establish, has unfortunately failed to be the integrative strategic tool that many of us had hoped it would be. So we have to find other ways of collaborating effectively at the country level. But I want to just finish with a plea that perhaps you can learn much more from the humanitarian community than you suspect. There tends to be the view that, yes, we can learn with those dealing with the transition to development. But the humanitarian community gets a bit of a bad rap. It's still seen as a world of Toyota four-wheel drives and expats doing their little local Lawrence of Arabia thing. But it's not really modern humanitarianism. If you look at the actors today, many more of them are local. If I could just take the example of the white helmets in Syria, a remarkable movement of people helping the victims of that conflict on all sides, who are trying to ensure that there is assistance delivered across communities. And they provide a much lower cost development model than a expatriate-based one. And there's a tendency to think, yes, but they don't meet the World Bank criteria of institution building. But I would warrant a guess that in places like Syria and in Haiti and in other places, where new legitimate cross-ethnic, cross-religious, cross-class institutions are going to emerge from is not from support to top-down government institution building, but from civil society groups which are going to grow up as an alternative to the failed government these countries have had to deal with. And so, within that world, there is a lot to focus on. And within that world, too, there's a huge amount being done in terms of beneficiary feedback through use of mobile phone surveys and other techniques to really make it a much more accountable sector than I suspect many of you imagine. And so the lessons of the conference in Istanbul earlier this year, which I'm sure Valerie Amos will be able to speak to much better than me, is not just about costs and scale of delivery, but about how new trusted institutions will, if you like, emerge from this grassroots. So let me finish in a sense where I began, just by saying that, the bank has to be in this space because it's central to development. Violence is not just something at the start that gets kicked aside. And as we look across the development challenges going forward of continued population growth in parts of the world, continued and rapid urbanization, a struggle over resources as water and other resources become scarce, I think we have to assume, unless the world has the ambition and statesmanship to jump to a very different model of development, a sustainable development model in the next few years, that we're going to see more environmental threats, more social threats from urbanization and the breakdown of security in these new cities, more wars over resources and disadvantage than we've seen before. So the bank needs to go on getting better at this, because violence and conflict, I suspect, will be part of the development condition for all of our professional lifetimes. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'm Raj Kumar. I'm the president and editor-in-chief of DevX. We're on a tight timeline, so I'm going to ask our panelists to just join us. We've roped Mark Malloch Brown into staying with us and joining us on stage. Panelists, please join us here. Feel free. Just as we get started, I thought I might, thank you, please. I thought I might just confess to a bad habit, which hopefully not too many of you in the room share, which is that I like to occasionally look at some of the articles you'll see in the mainstream media on topics like Syria, on other conflicts happening in the world, and occasionally after reading what is often great reporting, I like to go down and read the comments. This is very dangerous. It's like watching reality television. And if you see these comments, you start to see some themes come through. Lots of people think these conflicts are sort of inevitable, that they'll go on forever, that we should just let them play out as they might. There's a sentiment that aid money, whether for humanitarian or development purposes, may just get wasted. Why should we do it? There's the idea that really failure is likely. The risks are too high. And it can be depressing to read those comments, but what is sometimes worse, if we're really honest with ourselves, is that a drop of that fatalism sometimes permeates our own community, the global development and humanitarian communities. Sometimes, as I think Mark rightly said, we can be worried about taking risks. We can fear the consequences of trying to get involved in areas that seem intractable, that are extremely tough to penetrate. So I think what's so brilliant about this event, and I congratulate the Independent Evaluation Group and Caroline, and we're certainly delighted as DevX to be a media partner. What's so important about it, I think, today is that we're getting the right people around the table to say, this is possible, this can work, as we heard from Mark, some specific ideas on what the future might look like, that entails engagement from the bank at a different level and engagement from the humanitarian community at a different level. So that's what we're going to get into in our conversation today. And I want to start with Laura Fragility, who leads Italy's Development Cooperation Agency. And you were here at the bank for some 25 years. So I think Mark did a brilliant job, really a tour de force, taking us through the issues that underlie this topic and really some practical ideas. You've been here in the early days when issues around the bank's engagement in conflict societies were brought up. You now are in a country that is dealing with a massive migration crisis. Some of you may have seen the news that Angela Merkel is spending this weekend in Mali and Ethiopia and elsewhere and in Niger, precisely to try to make the case that we're going to be talking about on this panel, that we need to invest more, that development cooperation can work. So give us your broad perspective on this topic, Laura.
Thank you. I think that Mark actually said it all, both as an historian of the bank from the inside and also having observed the bank from outside. I think basically two important things. I think in terms of how the science around what needs to be done or how to intervene in fragile situations has evolved. The first one, that it's really a very different type of business than the business that an organization like the bank or a bilateral development agencies like, for example, the one that I'm leading at the moment, are used to, in a sense that the uncertain, the unknown is so important in terms of making it possible for an organization to achieve or not the objectives that they, propose to themselves. And I think that the important thing is the fact that we always see a situation of fragility and we immediately want to intervene. We want to intervene because it's a compelling case of people suffering and being in pain or having gone through, very difficult circumstances. And the reality is that we know very little about what are the real triggers that cause that conflict. And if we understand, we do understand the macro picture, we do understand the big picture of the conflict, but we really don't understand very well how that conflict plays at the level of the communities where we want to intervene.
I think Caroline used the term, sorry to interrupt, political economy, right? Understanding who are all of these players in societies that are sometimes very different from where we may be from.
And so who are the people that are actually going to help us achieve those results? Who are the people that we should use to be able to deliver those services to the population, to start those economic activities that will bring people back on their feet, et cetera, et cetera? And what kind of values and what kind of positions they actually represent, and how are they going to use the resources that we entrust them with. And I think that, accepting with humility that the situation is a very different situation from the cost-benefit analysis that we are used to, to use in terms of defining whether or not we want to, fund or not a certain intervention. I think that it's an important thing. I'm saying this just to give you a very quick example. You made a reference to, Italy and how it's affected, with the migration crisis. We are now, as a government, debating whether or not we are going to have, again, a kind of a political representation in Libya. Libya is a critical country for us. It's critical in terms of, the stability of the region. It's critical because it's a transit area and it's the main gate to Europe, for migration. And as we are going to have we are having this debate internally. Of course, the position that I may represent as someone who leads an agency that is really only concerned about development objectives are very different from the position of my colleagues from Foreign Service, who are actually very concerned about the security of the Italian citizens on the ground, because should anything happen to them, they are the ones that have to live with those consequences. And how you mediate these different positions that are so critical, and at the same time trying to find something that still pushes the agenda forward and get some objectives done, that's a big challenge, and there are lots of tensions even within one single administration.
That's a great example, and I think, Valerie, this is something you dealt with in your own context. Of course, you now direct SOAS at the University of London, but we all know you well from your time at OCHA. And I know one of the things you probably have battle scars from, being there at a time when crisis was at an unprecedented level, was trying to coordinate all of the various assets and agencies of the UN system. It's a lot like coordinating within an individual government, the various agencies with their objectives. And now we're adding to this already complicated mix of humanitarian agencies the development community, and saying there shouldn't be this divide anymore, and institutions like the bank should play a bigger role. So given that experience that you've had, tell us a little bit about how you see this potentially going forward. How might we stitch together an international community that is actually working at the same common purpose and working together in a way that amplifies our resources?
Well, I think the big thing that's missing is a shared analysis of the problem. So we look at countries and how the challenges emerge in very different ways. We have very different models, we have different ways of working, we have different operating systems. So the humanitarian system works much more closely with civil society partners, has its own bureaucracy, as does the way the development community works. And we started to try to break that down, particularly looking at countries facing disasters and thinking about how you could do more preventive work in those countries. But the humanitarian aspects of the fragile state agenda has very much been left off the table for a long time. And we're only now beginning to think about that, which is a real problem. So if you just think about this from a UN perspective, even without the bank, you have the political context, you may have a peacekeeping context, you have humanitarian, you have the work on peace building, a nightmare coordinating across the UN system. I think it's vital that the bank is added into that mix. And what I think it needs is a shared analysis, then thinking through who is best placed to address different aspects of that particular challenge. We've talked about fragile states and conflict. It's important, and poverty. We also need to add the environmental consequences of all of this, because that is a big dimension as well. So I would like to see something that's much more joined up and integrated. Jan Eliasson talked about horizontal rather than vertical. It's very hard to do. And I'd like to add one other thing. I talk about politics all the time because I think understanding the political context is key, and being honest about that political context. So quite frankly, there are countries in which it's really difficult to work because the leadership is not there and the commitment to what you're seeking to achieve is not there. And the data tells us which those countries are, where we have put a huge amount of money with very, very little outcome. So I think a bit more honesty about the political challenges is also necessary.
Absolutely, and we've now heard a perspective from a donor country, from a UN, a global perspective. I want to bring in Alain Bifani, who is a Director General at the Ministry of Finance in Lebanon. Give us a sense from your perspective. You have incoming missions from lots of agencies and governments and multilateral and bilaterals. How would you like to see all of this joined up, to use Valerie's term?
What we would like to see, obviously, is tools that are matching with the situation. We started dealing with the institutions when the conflict of Lebanon, the 15 years conflict, at the beginning of the 90s was over, and we had at that time a traditional approach and traditional tools, and it was working very well because it was about reconstruction. Now, all of a sudden, the situation is everything but traditional. I mean, just to give you the perspective, we are now hosting, a country of 4 million Lebanese is hosting 1.7 million refugees from Syria, which is about the number that the whole of the European Union with the 530 million citizens is hosting. And this situation, of course, calls for tools that are adequate. And here, we were in the midst of adversity, being considered as a middle-income country, and therefore with whatever rules apply to those middle-income countries, until together with our partners, namely the World Bank, we were able to develop a tool that was adapted. And this is, for instance, I mean, one of them is the concessional financial facility that the World Bank has launched. And the idea behind is simply that because grant money has become scarce, because we're not finding it, because when we established initially a trust fund for Lebanon, during 4 years we hardly received $100 million, and the losses are already $17 billion. This tool takes into consideration the fact that the developmental agenda, which is critical because the answer is not humanitarian and securitarian only, it cannot last. It has to be an answer that relies on development. And in this perspective, we took into consideration that whatever projects in infrastructure that were taking place were beneficial for the Lebanese, and this explains why there are market rates that apply, but they're also benefiting the refugees, and this explains why it has to be concessional, because it's like a grant part. Now, this doesn't mean that it is enough. For the time being, we are still looking for more aid to buy down the interests on the facility. And Lebanon and also Jordan were very supportive of the extension of this facility for it to become global, because we don't want to have other countries in the world waiting like we did for aid to come. It has to be ready. It has to be a safety net that exists. And therefore, this is one of the examples that we can have that are in place. Of course, we can think about different other issues. At some point, institutions like the bank should be allowed, and the new Secretary General of the UN used to say that a couple of years ago, should be allowed to provide grant money immediately whenever we are facing situations of emergency. On the other hand, we are also faced with issues like limits. And it is critical to have limits, of course, because of the sustainability of the system, because we cannot go beyond what we are able to do. But here, if we have an intervention at two levels, one that is precisely supportive of the interest to be paid on the debt, i.e. buying down interest on existing debt, this would naturally release the limits to be given and increase them potentially for the rest of the development agenda. We can also, of course, think about different other issues, but what matters today in what has been put together is that we are taking into consideration immediate emergencies, things that are not necessarily already thought about, that can be of a huge magnitude, and that development agencies should be ready to cope with.
Christian Rebergen, I want to bring you into this conversation, and you are Director General for International Cooperation at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Netherlands. One of the things that underlies, I think, what Elaine was mentioning is the new normal that we're in. Yes, there are emergencies that come on the map instantly that we maybe didn't realize were going to come and that are very significant, need to be addressed, but then we have these prolonged crises. So much of the displacement that we see, so much of the conflict that we see has been around, in many cases, for decades. How do we address a world where there is rising crises, whether from environmental causes or internal instability? How do we, as a development cooperation, humanitarian community, as the World Bank, what's your vision for this?
Yes, well, thank you. I'll say something from the perspective from a donor and what we actually do to deal with this dilemma where, let's say, if you want commitment to solve these issues, you need long-term commitment, and at the same time we work in political cycles where we have elections every 4 years, and we want to show results. And if there's any area where it's quite difficult to show results, it's working in conflict areas. I mean, that's the truth. But it's a dilemma for, let's say, if I want to explain to the taxpayers in the Netherlands, what did I actually achieve? I mean, we work in countries like Yemen, in Mali, in Burundi, in South Sudan, and those are not the countries where you can easily come up with that the situation is much better than before we started, honestly. So that's the dilemma. What we believe very much in working in well, as Lord Malloch-Brown said, in working in partnerships. So also, for instance, with the military. I mean, not to use ODA for military expenses, but to really, we need them. You need a stable environment to be effective, to do some of your programs. I met every 2 weeks with our chief of staff of the defense ministry to see where we can work together. For instance, in Mali, they are very active in the MINUSMA UN operation. And we have some civil experts within that mission, and then we exchange and we see what we can do. We can do some basic services within the UN operation. We both work on rule of law. So the military is one example. The diplomats, as you were referring to, because many of the issues can only solve politically. And I really agree that it's so difficult, I think, as donors to really get into this, let's say, political issues. We often make things worse. We have a bad track record in good governance, honestly, as donors. So I think we should be honest. So actually, be more and more focused not on state building, but on, let's say, working with the military, but also with NGOs and the business sectors. NGOs, because they really know the situation on the ground, and I think there's one lesson we can learn is that you really need to understand the situation on the ground. And I think that maybe that's also one lesson I would say for the World Bank, because if you want to be effective in these areas, you need probably more people on the ground. And a different division, how people here in headquarters, probably why don't you have your regional vice presidents in Tunis or in Africa? I mean, that would make sense, I would say. And finally, maybe on working with the business sector. I mean, businesses won't solve anything, and it's not easy to get business to work in fragile countries. But if there is economic growth, if there is jobs, if there is, I mean, that would really make a difference. And they are the ones who can really also do advocacy for a more stable environment. For instance, we work in Lebanon and in Jordan with Dutch SMEs and local SMEs to get them access to finance, which is often, of course, a big problem. And that really helps because it just creates jobs, and that contributes to a stable environment.
Let's stay on this theme for a second. I want to bring in Sophie de Keen, who is with UNDP. You're the Deputy Regional Director for Arab states there. So let's just stay on this theme of what is the role for development institutions. We're talking about fragile and conflict societies, but what should development institutions actually be doing in these places?
Thank you very much, and for those of you who are looking for me in the pamphlet, I'm replacing Gustavo, who couldn't make it today. So thank you for allowing me to come a little bit last minute. I think one of the things I wanted to start off by saying is not too long ago we had the World Humanitarian Summit, and in that summit I think, and it was very key, and the UN Secretary General took it up in his document subsequently, is how important working in that nexus between humanitarian and development is. And I was going to say a few things, but I'm going to change a little bit. I'll say a few general comments, give some examples, and at the same time I picked up a couple of questions, even though they're going
Yes,
so
you may have
fast.
noticed there are questions scrolling. Many of you are using the Poll Ev app already.
Really quickly.
But go ahead.
So I think the protracted nature of crisis today, really, including the Syria crisis and others, has required the international community to rethink the way all the actors operate in a crisis. And so we really need to ensure that humanitarian development crisis, or nexus rather, trickles down. We need to ensure that we collaborate much earlier in the crisis, and when the crisis does occur, that we work even closer during the crisis. And I think one of the, linking to that nexus, we have to avoid discussions of phasing. So where we start with a humanitarian phase and then come later with a development phase. I think all of this has to go together. And let me just give you a couple of examples where I think UNDP and other development organizations are continuing to work during crisis. So if I look at Yemen, for example, and here I just wanted to, we've been talking about whether the World Bank has the people on the ground, et cetera. Well, one of the solutions to that is to work with an organization such as UNDP.
We heard that call from Mark earlier,
That is on the
yes.
ground. And Mark, you'll be happy to know that we have collaborated with the World Bank in Yemen to do an innovative a partnership, but because the World Bank is not in Yemen and wanted to provide a little over $100 million towards the Social Development Fund. So how to do that if you're not there? Well, it's to work through UNDP. So we're having a very good partnership there. I think that's going to have positive returns because it's all about providing fast work, cash for work, and needed services at the local level, which are so important whether you're in a crisis or not. And then there was a question, there were a couple of questions on policies when we're coming to crisis situations, and I think the colleague from Lebanon referred to this as well. UNDP, whether it's in Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey, and where the refugees have gone to stay in host communities, and oftentimes the poorest communities in those countries. And so we have a policy of ensuring, and I think you alluded to this, that when we do work in a country such as Lebanon or Jordan, and we're working in the host communities, it's so important that if we're working with youth unemployment, that we address not only the youth of that country, but also the refugees. You can't go into these host communities and do one or the other, that it's really important, and the dialogue on discussing. Finally, and this is also, I think it's related to one of the questions that I saw, so I wanted to bring it up. It related to local ownership and the participatory and importance of having local ownership, local actors participate in and deciding on what is important for their own community. So here I want to refer to Iraq, where UNDP and others are working on the stabilization facility, and the Deputy Secretary General referred to it earlier, the importance of once an area is secure, and in order to, one, either avoid the people that are leaving their homes, or to be able to bring people who had left earlier that are internally displaced, to bring them back to their homes, we go and discuss with the local authorities, the local community, and they determine what are the emergency priorities that they require with regards to basic services. Maybe they need electricity, maybe they don't, maybe they have it and they need school rehabilitation or health center rehabilitation. So that's what we're doing in Iraq, and it's becoming extremely effective, and people are coming back to their homes. I think that's the result that we're looking for.
It's good to hear that positive story. I want to bring Christoph Zürcher into this conversation because this is something you've actually studied. You're a professor at the University of Ottawa. I know you're on your way to Afghanistan, somewhere you spent a lot of time. We just heard a little bit from Sophie about this idea of phasing, and there still is a concept. There's a security phase, there's a humanitarian phase, and there's a development phase. Based on what you've studied and seen about what works and what doesn't work, is that still the model we should be pursuing, and what does work? I know that.
Thank you so much. These are really interesting questions. I've been trying to study what works and what doesn't work. And there seems to be a consensus that what does not work is that external donors and aid can help to build up state capacities at the central level. So it's very rare that our intervention, our aid intervention, can actually rebuild the state at the level where it matters, at the political leads level. What seems to work much better is restoring basic services, things like roads and basic education and schools, and electricity to heat, electricity to cook, electricity to recharge the mobile phones, which is connectivity. These kind of things work, and they do have an effect, they do have an impact on how the local populations perceives the government. It has a positive effect. There's one big but, and the but is it only works in secure areas. So we have to have a decent amount of security, and then this kind of positive trajectory kicks in. So if all of this is true, then one of the big questions is, so state building on top level doesn't work, but basic services seems to work. Why don't we do more of this? Why aren't we more modest in our ambitions? And this is a remarkable agreement here on the panel that these kind of things are useful in their work. But we don't do it that often. And I wonder why. And part of the answer is, I think, this kind of not modest thinking, this kind of, in a way, hubris thinking, emerges in a dialogue between donors and beneficiaries, donors and the recipient countries. And this dialogue often goes like that. I'm the representative of a fragile country. I do not want to ask for humanitarian aid or basic stuff because I want to be seen like a normal state. I want to have fancy things, 5-year plans. And then I'm the donor now, and my ambition is I want to create sustainable things. I want to change things, right? And this kind of narrative leads to kind of a hubris. And because of this, we keep doing the things that do not work. And I'm not saying that we can save the world or a fragile state by doing these little things. What I think, it would make sense to, to defer sustainability and addressing structural changes and structural violence for 10 years. And within those 10 years, maybe, focus on the things that we know that do work. And that requires more modesty. It also requires much more attention to details. Because lots of these things, they do work in one district, not in the next district. In one province, not in the next province. So if we develop those tools to address the political economy at the provincial and district level and be more modest, I think that would gain a lot.
And you know what may lead us in that direction is, to Christian's point, being more local. Having people who are on the ground who know how difficult it is, who can be more modest, who know what works and what doesn't. I want Mark to get into this, but I know, Valerie, you wanted to jump in.
Well, I wanted to be a bit more controversial, but I think it's been done for me, because I think that sometimes we get into a huge sort of aid umbrella, a sort of juggernaut, and it's for ourselves, actually, because we're so worried about what's happening in a country, and we look at what's happening to people, but we won't admit that the kind of sustained, structural, long-term change that we want to see can only happen if you've got a government that's collaborating and working in partnership with you in the kind of, to bring about those kind of long-term developments. Without it, you're not going to get that sustained change in the sectors that are crucial and vital. So you come up with these 5-year plans and 10-year plans and evaluations, and the evaluations actually tell you that you're not getting the outcome that you're seeking to get. So you change the model slightly, but actually we continue to do the same things and we work with the same partners. We need to ask ourselves, what difference are we making? Are we doing more harm? We talk about not doing harm, but actually I think in many instances we are propping up governments that actually couldn't manage without an aid infrastructure and aren't necessarily listening and engaging with their own people, and yet we are in a way doing it for them. We have become a kind of a proxy in that relationship. And that's partly because we have a huge institutional challenge, because as the United Nations, as the World Bank, we are these intergovernmental organizations with sovereign states where you have, of course, to have respect for what those countries and their leadership say they want to do and how they want to do it.
That's a very important cautionary note, and I'm glad you brought it in. I do want to make sure we're also thinking, though, about Laura's challenge that you put to us about a place like Libya. The Italian government has to do something, has to engage. We'll come back to that, but I want to get Mark. You've listened to this conversation. You gave us an incredible overview to start, but what has come out of it from your perspective?
Look, I'm keen to let you get to the question.
And can you take the microphone?
Sorry, I'm keen to let you get to the questions because I had a good shot at the beginning, but I think this point about, I really like this point about modesty and hubris. I think it's hugely important, and I just see questions come up, why are we only now getting to the grassroots? Because I think, it is the case that where countries really are failed or regions are failed in terms of governance, there is no shortcut from building up from the bottom, and there is no alternative to that being locally led. I use the Syrian example of how in this country whose national institutions are all discredited, born out of the humanitarian effort itself is a grassroots movement of Syrians, which has been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. It didn't get it, but nevertheless, it is probably the best bet of a legitimate institution which is trans community in Syria that we have. Well, the bank is a million miles away from knowing how to bet on a grassroots humanitarian brigade. I mean, that couldn't be further from the institutions you're looking for in terms of top-down investment. So modesty and patience about where to begin with all of this, and really, really good local political understanding brought in from your partners are the key things, I think, in some of these situations.
So Laura, can you just pick up on this question of Libya? You've got a real life scenario that you've got to deal with, that you're dealing with every day now. How has this conversation illuminated for you, if at all? What do you do, given the kind of tough choices there are in a situation like that?
Well, I think that, what everybody, stressed is that there is really a tension between the need to intervene to solve big problems and the reality that you just don't have the structure or infrastructure, not the infrastructure, physical infrastructure, but just the institutional infrastructure, to be able to do that in a way that is reliable. So it's a trial and error type of thing. You have to take some risks. We all have said that. The two keynote speakers that, started this session said that. This is not a business for people who want to get it right the first time. It's just not going to happen. So you have to trust a little bit your, the local intelligence that you have. In some cases, and I go back to that example of Libya, we don't even know if the counterparts that we are identifying locally are actually reliable ones. So we have to,
But you're willing to take that risk?
Well, I see that the counterfactual of not taking that risk is, more negative than just taking that risk and failing. There is no alternative to that. I mean, inaction is a non-option in many cases. And so from there, you have to decide. And of course, you do what in the bank, we used to have a very nice paras it was called in those days a staff appraisal report, where you were saying mitigating factors. So you try to identify as many as possible mitigating factors to mitigate this risk, and you decide to do that. And then, of course, you have to deal at times with consequences that for us as government are tough. If our staff are kidnapped or they are killed, et cetera, et cetera. This is a big thing. And somehow it's very difficult for our internal public opinion to understand that it was a right decision from a global point of view to make these people take that risk. When you have to go and talk to those families, then that becomes a very complicated conversation.
The questions that we're getting, as you can all see, many of them deal with some of these hard things that you just got into. How, you really kind of need a strong state as a partner, but in many circumstances you don't have one. How do you address the sovereignty question when maybe it's really not the right partner at the state level, but you still have to work with them? And we've had questions that get to this issue of we need to be modest, but at the same time we need to be ambitious because these challenges are so huge and growing. I'm curious from your perspective, Elaine, you've had these conversations about a current, very severe situation in your country.
Yes, thank you, Raj. What I wanted to say, and by being very practical, is that we have now a situation that is nearly catastrophe to face. We have something that weighs on growth, on employment, on social safety nets, environment and infrastructure. I fully agree that part of the answer is to provide the proper infrastructure. And this is something that the program that I was referring to through CFF is taking care of. But at the same time, it is critical to support the institutions in whatever shape they are, because otherwise, you will not be able to have sustainability in this approach. And for instance, we are a country that is typical. We are a country that doesn't have a president of the republic for 2.5 years. It doesn't have parliament that is convening. A cabinet is hardly working. But at the same time, our institutions are able to cope with huge amount of stress. For instance, in the education, we were able to absorb for 210,000 Lebanese students in the public sector. We have already absorbed 250,000 Syrian students, and we are aiming at 410,000 in the coming 2 years. This is an example of a situation where, by supporting the capacity, the institutional capacity of a specific administration that can work, you can do wonders when you don't have a state that is working properly. This is one thing.
And if I understand right, you have your schools running on many shifts during the day.
Exactly. We have 2 shifts every day. And those 2 shifts are working perfectly well because it's very clear in our mind that we don't want lost generations. Now, in addition to that, to be very practical once again, we are dealing with institutions that exist, that have rules and regulations. And what we want to see, for instance, is immediate adaptation to the situation. For instance, when we talk about classification according to middle-income countries or whatever, to the level of income, I think it doesn't make sense when you're facing shocks like that. And in any case, even when you don't have a shock, it doesn't make a lot of sense because within a certain level of income, you have so much inequality nowadays, rising everywhere in the world, by the way, that this has to be put into perspective. And finally, I would like to touch upon something that was discussed many times those 2 days, and that is to adapt the business models of the institutions. It is a fact that we need sometimes to look at the business models in view of the existent. For instance, we've been talking about promoting private sector development and financing for infrastructure. This is a very interesting topic, and this is definitely something that is imposing itself because of how huge the needs are. But at the same time, if we are in an insecure environment, it's definitely the public sector that has to show the way. Otherwise, we're not going to get anything.
Absolutely, and I think, to me, trying to think ahead, you just said something very provocative for this group, I think, which is an institution that has long been focused on categorizing countries by income. You're saying that's really not so relevant for the world we're in now, where there are many countries facing real shocks. And we're similarly hearing a lot of discussion about humanitarian versus development, the divide. We've been talking about this for decades now. I wonder, Mark gave us a great historical perspective. If we look to the future a bit, are we still going to be talking about a development community and a humanitarian community 5 years from now? Will that divide effectively go away? Must it go away?
I think that there are some very particular things that are done on the humanitarian side, which it's important to recognize. I mean, part of the challenge, I think, in conflict situations is that humanitarians stay too long because development partners don't feel able to come in at an earlier stage. That is changing, but it hasn't changed fast enough.
This phasing problem that Sophie referred to.
So there should be complementary strategies ongoing almost from the beginning, in my view. Fragile countries, yes, there are similarities, but there are a lot of differences between them because the fragility comes from very different things. So you do have some countries that have fragility but do have strong institutions that can help to withstand some of that, and others that cannot. And where the institutions are not strong, my view is that there should be a lot of focus actually on issues to do with rule of law and accountability. Because when you begin to get that right, you give a structure and a framework for ordinary citizens to feel that they can engage in a very different way. There was a question much, much earlier on about what should we do about, as it were, structural inequality to do with things like human rights, which is at the heart of some of this in some societies. And some of the research has shown very, very clearly that one of the indicators that a country may well slide down into violence is what happens in terms of human rights abuses and how those abuses begin to increase over time. And that is a factor, if you look at, you can see that that country may well be sliding into something much more serious. So,
of course, the big question is, what do we do? If we see that indicator, what do we do? We've got, unfortunately, a hard stop, and we're running out of time. I want to give the last word to Mark. You kindly sat through a lot of this conversation after giving this great introductory keynote, and I wonder, now that you've laid out so many practical steps you'd like to see this institution take, what do you think the barriers are to actually doing this? The bank has done quite a bit in the case of Lebanon and elsewhere, of changing the way it operates. Where do you see it going?
Well, look, I think we do have to to separate. Someone's been asking the question, several have, about the apparent contradiction by suddenly talking about modesty when earlier we were talking about risk-taking. And I think, the first is to understand which is right for which situation. Modesty is about encouraging and nurturing grassroots development where there is no other alternative because institutions are gone. And that has its own risk-taking involved in it. But the big-scale financial risk deployment that I'm talking about is much more where you've got a huge number of beneficiaries, and kidding yourself that piloting with a few thousand is living up to your mandate is a mistake. You have to take things to scale even when there are risks of failure. So, when Lebanon puts 400,000 people in school, you should be right there at their shoulder, helping them in a way which is appropriate and scaled. So I think, it's a matter of getting beyond sort of tired, cautious, partial solutions which at one end fail to understand the local political context, and at the other end just don't offer the scalability that's required, because, others get the security side and get the political side. Others are closer to the grassroots. But what this institution has is the ability to mobilize huge development resources, human and financial, to really help shape the policy environment on the economic and social side in important ways and put the resources in. So, I think really the issue here is that the bank needs to bring the same originality and management and energy to this part of its portfolio that it brings to helping an old stable friend of a middle-income country which is steadily making its way up the income charts. That's nice, but it's easy. This is difficult, and it's often ends with an egg in the face and a bloody eye, but it's got to be done, and the bank needs the courage to do it.
Well, I think, thinking with my editor-in-chief hat on, that is the headline, that there is hard work to do, but the bank has a growing role in it. And I want to thank this incredible panel, all of you who've contributed questions, the several hundred people who are following along online. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have to end. Thank you.